All right, welcome everybody around the world. Welcome to all my subscribers. So, for this video today on the topic of giants, one of my um, favorite topics to research and talk about, I'm focusing on a little corner, a little niche, which are a few types of uh, giants, ancient giants. Um, Different traditions from around the world. I'll get into each. A lot of these are primarily like from Europe. I think maybe some from Asia. But anyways, the important thing is I want to talk about a very plausible theory that I have that altogether just helps substantiate and help verifies their existence, right? That I'm going to show plausible uh, scenario how they could actually have existed, right? We may or may not even have physical evidence of them. So just bear with me. Now, it'd be a very interesting theory. That's why I want to make this video. So I'll mention my theory first because that's the cool part before I just start talking about these different giants and what they might actually be and or be related to and all that. So basically, my theory is that one of the little things I'm going to read from is about this ancient species of extinct giant lemur. Okay, and it was about 550 pounds, between 350 to 550 pounds. They don't have a complete skeleton. There's a skull depicted, whether it's from that lemur or not doesn't really matter. But what I noticed, everybody's familiar with lemurs, and I know that some of them have more like a snout and all of that, and there were bigger ones. But when I looked at that skull, like if somebody showed you that skull of like what a giant lemur's skull looks like, you would think it's some cryptid mythical beast of legend. Like it literally looks like some werewolf or Cynocephali dogman type head. Like it doesn't look normal. You wouldn't think, oh, this is an ape or this is a lemur. It just looks monstrous. It looks human like, but has this big snout with these teeth and big eye sockets and all of that. So that got me thinking that, and this one species of giant ancient lemur, Archaeoindris, this existed up until around 350 BC, they're saying. So people very well, explorers could have very well seen these. And it makes me think back to these accounts from, I think it was like the Tales of John Mandeville, and or if not that one, there's other like little writings, I think from Europe over the last 1 or 2 thousand years or so, where historians of the time would write these accounts of their journeys or people's journeys to other lands and what creatures or beings lived there. And they always had like these European ones. I think there was like two or three different ancient writers who did similar, and one of them might have even been like, was it Philo or Strato or something. But anyways, right from like the first century AD or something like that. But nonetheless, there's like three of them from Europe who wrote about it, and they almost always mention the same like core classes of primitive, like somewhat mutant, you could say, humanoids. Um, there's one class is giant, one class is small, like dwarf type size or whatever, like the Flora's Hobbit. Um, Other categories are ones that have like one leg or like two legs fused as one, and they have to hop around. They don't like to move around too much, but they're pretty quick when they hop. Scapiopods or something like that. But the strange thing is that all the categories that the European travelers talk about, mind you, they are talking about these beings being found elsewhere on the planet, right? Keep that in mind. But these tales of such creatures, like all these different categories, they're found around the world on like all the inhabited continents, like of ancient peoples, like all of them: North, South America, Europe, Africa, oceanic islands, Australia, uh, the top of Asia, the Central Asia, Lower Asia, and India. All of them, they all have these, right? But it's kind of best summed up in those in those European accounts, just because it's like an account and it lists off all the weird and wondrous beings, right? And another category is Cyclops, right? And there again, traditions of Cyclops all around the world, right? So, and they always, all the different accounts from all around the world of these beings match, right? In what they look like, how they act. Most of the time, it's a straight match. So it leaves you with one of two scenarios. Like, how could it be possible for everybody around the world at different epochs of time to all be having the same beliefs when there's not really any known contact between, right? And it really makes you wonder, is either that they did come from one ancient, like more ancient source before everybody migrated out, and when we lived with bigger creatures back then, there's that one theory. Yeah, it's possible, but why? My point is, why would everybody carry that like mother theory down over thousands or tens of thousands, or I don't know, hundreds of thousands of years, and just carry on these beliefs in, these beings that don't exist? Like, if they don't exist, like, for it to be carried on that long, like, you can't say all of these are just the so-called nursery boogies, what they're called, or bogies, which is essentially like the boogeyman, where it's where a culture invents something to, like, help control children's behavior. Like, don't go in the forest at night because the boogeyman will get you, but it's just something not real. um, but the thing is that these cultures don't have the accounts of these giants and other, ancient creatures. They don't have them all documented as nursery boogies. Um, a lot of cultures believed full-heartedly that these beings existed. So, anyways, the interesting thing is that they all around the world share these things. So either they did just bring it down from like a mother belief system, before everybody migrated and separated out as humankind, and we all just stubbornly kept those beliefs over probably hundreds of thousands of years, or at least tens of thousands of years, all the way up until current. Like, that just seems unrealistic to me. But that's one scenario. Or that these beings, at least some of them, were real, right? Um, there you go. So you got one of those two scenarios. Either the creatures are real or they're not real. Like, those are the two solutions. They were real. Okay, well, that's why everybody talks about them. If they weren't real, oh, well, they were just legends carried down from the mother culture before humankind separated and migrated. So I just think the more plausible thing is that at least some of these beings had to exist, right? So I'm not necessarily here arguing that, massive giants existed. I mean, at least 10 or 12 feet, something like that, right? 9, 10, 11, 12, that type of range, between 9 and 12 feet. That would still make a giant quite menacing, especially if they looked more like archaic human or less human. That would be very monstrous and scary, and they're huge, and they would still be like supremely strong at that size, anyways. Um, I'm not here to argue for all sorts of other things. I'm not here to talk about all sorts of other topics and mythical creatures and all that. I'm just here to focus today on a niche of giants known as like the wild men. So, out of the list of all those beings, like from the European accounts, where you have a tribe of, giants, tribe of uh, dwarven-sized people, a tribe of cyclops who tended to be giants, tribe of another weird tribe, very strange tribe, which is described by other peoples around the world, not everywhere, but in other places and other continents, was things called like the blemies, where they don't really have a head, or if they have a head, it's like situated down here, or whatever it is. Either they don't have anything above their shoulders, right? And the facial features are either in the chest, or maybe their head is just like down. Maybe they have like no neck or something, and they just have like a very squat appearance like that. You know what I mean? But there's no like neck and head. Very odd, but lots of different people talk about them. People who are disconnected. You know what I mean? It all gets back to the same argument. So, race of beings like that, another race of beings that had just they looked human but had like very big ears. Um, they don't really specify what shape they were or what they looked like, but they might have just had more animal-like, from more archaic genes or whatnot. Some animal-like ears, or just, what I mean. They don't have to be like Dumbo ears or literally like donkey ears, but some really archaic gene got expressed in their genome, and they have whatever, just big ears. That's another common one. And oddly, another thing I want to mention, but I'm not here to focus on today, is something I've noticed in studying this from around the world, right? All these different cultures, is that a lot of cultures, I mean, a vast majority, when they're talking about these forest beings who live in the forest of like human size or smaller, most of the time, especially like wild ones, right? A lot of times their feet are pointed backwards, right? So from elves, elves, gnomes, like leprechaun size, duendes, all these different categories up to like human size around the world, a vast majority. If you could go check it yourself, call my bluff. A lot of them will say that the creatures leave tracks that look backwards because their feet point backwards. Now, this is such an odd feature for people around the world to be talking about. And the creatures who are said to have this feature from all these different global accounts fit the same category, small humanoid type creature, like a humanoid that lives in the forest, kind of like hobbits or whatever. So now that we know about genetics and genetic abnormalities and stuff, which ancient people didn't have a full proper grasp of. They knew that mother and father make a child that looks like them, and you could breed wolves and get dogs, and they knew it without knowing really what was going on. But they knew a fair bit. But the thing is I forgot where I was going with the genetics, but it'll come back to me like everything always does. So bear with me. um, but anyways, before I forget, another topic I forgot to say earlier was Cynocephali. It's in the title. Now, Cynocephali are said to be dog-headed people, werewolves, lycanthropes, and the like. Now, their descriptions and they're on like every inhabited continent. Okay, peoples from around the world talk about them too. Now, it's like all the major categories of what arguably are the most plausible forms of mythical creatures. Now, like, I think mermaids are probably unrealistic. Maybe there's some archaic sea creature that has a humanoid looking form and it's extinct now, and people thought them to be mermaids. I don't know. You know, I don't believe that they looked like a pretty European lady above the waist and had a fish's tail. Like, I don't believe that. I don't believe sirens looked like a bird but had the head of a woman. I don't believe in literal metamorphoses like that there, like mutations. Like, I don't believe that. But I believe that some of these ancient cryptids and this and that there could have a basis in reality. So I'm trying to look for more realistic explanations for it. So with Cynocephali, the dog-headed, they're talked about around the world. So could they be real? Right. So we got back to the same argument. Like maybe the concept of dog-headed people, werewolves, was something from the mother beliefs back before humans separated and migrated out to their own lands. Maybe, and maybe everybody just kept it. But again, why would each culture keep all these strange elements if they're not real over such a profound period of time? So anyways, the dog-headed people are another. Now, what's the difference between cynocephalic, dog-headed species, if they were to hypothetically be real, to humans? Like, the only real difference, like, they're allegedly human in form. Who cares how they mute? I'm not going to get into magic and sorcery and that they shapeshift and all this, right? They're just, the ancient peoples don't always describe them as shapeshifters. Like some cultures, like in North and South America, do. But at the end of the day, like, we're talking about something more realistic here, a reasonable explanation. Now, what they may have actually been is one of the species, such as Meganthropus. Okay, now Meganthropus was real. They found fossils for it. The teeth of Meganthropus can be up to about twice the size of humans, so they're definitely larger than us. They could have stood between 7 to 9 feet tall, so they would be giants compared to us. A 7 foot tall person is huge, but a 9 foot tall person would be massive. That's like Robert Wadlow, but properly built. And Meganthropus did not look fully human. Meganthropus had a projecting jaw, and the reconstructed estimate of what the skull would look like, it looks more like, I'm not a scientist, but it looks like some of those baboon type apes that have like this dog type face. And when you consider that they were probably very hairy all over the body, right, or at least more than like modern man typically is, if they were then they were real, when did they exist? Let's go check this out again. So from early Pleistocene to the middle Pleistocene. So I checked that timing out. That takes it up to. Oh, I closed the window now, but it starts from like 2.5 million years ago, but goes up to I think the Pleistocene goes from 2.5 million years ago up to like 11,000. So it's very broad, but it goes up to recent. But these ones here, Meganthropus, and it's just from the little bit that they know from what they're theorizing now, but based on what they can claim now, what they say now, it was to middle Pleistocene. So whatever, like 50 or 100,000 years ago, right? But it's possible, and it's actually realistic, that Meganthropus did walk amongst ancient man, right? So whether we were still Homo erectus at that point, maybe a couple 100,000 years ago, no, I think we were Homo sapiens at that point, if all of that stuff is true. But just going on the whim of what science says here, right? I think Homo sapiens did exist back then, right? But back then, Neanderthals still existed, probably some Cro-Magnons and some others, and maybe even some Homo erectus were walking around. Homo erectus would have looked um, much more archaic and primitive, maybe even more ape-like, or probably more hairy. Just they would look more archaic, right? They'd have big brow ridges and all of that, and they would look markedly different than the average Homo sapien, but they would still look like they're somewhat related to us. So all the going back a couple 100,000 years, our ancestors or whoever was around then was existing with creatures like that, with beings like that. And Gigantopithecus existed until 10, 20,000 years ago, something like that. It wasn't that long ago that it died out. Gigantopithecus was not primarily bipedal, though. So one thing I wanted to mention as well that I thought about earlier is that in all these accounts of, wild men or hairy giants in the jungles and the forests and all of that, ogres and trolls, they're not described as walking on fours ever. That's not part of. That's not a quality that's ever relayed in any of these stories ever, right? I can't recall ever seeing that anywhere. I think ancient peoples in most continents did actually have some form of lemur or monkey living there, and any lemur or monkey would show them, oh, look, they kind of have a humanoid body shape, right? Even if they didn't know all those scientific terms, they don't need to. They could recognize, oh, well, this creature is different than all the other creatures. It looks kind of humanish. Um, and I'm pretty sure some form of that. I mean, they found monkeys and art from all the continents anyway, so like North and South America, because people traveled back then. If you had some ancient Phoenicians or Vikings, somebody at some point is going to make a boat, and or maybe a monkey survived on. Well, that's probably unrealistic. A little monkey holding on to a raft or piece of wood and going across like one of the oceans is pretty unrealistic. But there were ancient seafarers and probably ones we never heard about who did somehow make it across the oceans back then. They keep finding evidence for things like this, and it's possible that once in a while they bring over apes or monkeys. So that's probably why they had, or maybe there were extinct species of monkeys and apes in places that science doesn't know about right now. But in either case, people were aware of apes, right? And something like an ape or a lemur lives in like every continent. So I mean, like if the average person back then saw a monkey or an ape, it's not like, oh, we're from the West and we're dopey or whatever people might say, and you just haven't seen an ape before and you think that it's a person, right? Where you see a gorilla and you call it an ogre. So I don't think people are that ignorant and narrow-minded. I don't think that's what's happening. All apes, even gorillas and chimps, are primarily quadrupedal. They are not primarily bipedal, right? So none of these wild men, ancient giants, trolls, ogres, Cynocephali are ever noted as walking on fours. They're all bipedal. So I think my point is we can rule out actual apes as being any of the solutions here. However, the giant lemur that I mentioned earlier, Archaeoindris, stood around, they said, the size of a gorilla. It must have been pretty big, like a gorilla, because they estimate 350 to 500 pounds. Like normally, when a human's 350 to 500 pounds, they're either very large, to put it politely, or they're maybe 7 feet tall. Because when you're 7 feet tall, 350 pounds is probably like a healthy weight, right? Especially if you're of like a athletic build or whatever. That would probably be standard. I mean, I used to know a bodybuilder who was probably under 6 feet tall. But when he was built up and working out, like in season, he weighed 400 plus pounds. It was incredible. He could deadlift 800 pounds, and he did it right in front of me. So that's a person, right? But you get my point. Like if you're a regular sized person and you weigh 350 and you're not obese, you're fit, you're going to look super muscular. Kind of like how gorillas aren't obese. They're super muscular, but they're a little bit shorter than us. You follow me? So my point is um, people aren't going to fool apes for anything. However, Archaeandrus, this very large extinct giant lemur, that thing there, lemurs look a lot more person-like than a gorilla does. Like I don't think anybody in the right minds can see a gorilla and actually think, oh, that's a type of forest person. No, I'm sorry, no. Orangutans, sometimes orangutans walk around a lot on two legs. And if you saw an orangutan walking around, they kind of do more resemble a person, albeit they have shaggy hair. But like if they turn at the right angle and you see their body, you'd be like, oh, you could think they're a person of the forest. It's entirely possible. And orangutan, I think, means that person of the forest. But gorillas, I don't think anybody in their right mind, even if a gorilla is standing upright, they don't stand upright and walk around on two legs long enough to ever for anybody to really think that they're a person. You know what I mean? I think an orangutan can walk around a little bit more. And all monkeys can run on two legs and stuff, but nobody in the right mind is going to look at a monkey or a lemur and think, oh, that's a type of person, right? But a giant lemur, the size of a human, right? And when you look at the skull of giant lemurs, they look like human type skulls, just with like, it looks like a werewolf skull, to be honest. Like it's quite freaky. And there's species of lemur and baboon and ape that have a dog-like profile, and they're called, I think, baboon, or one of them is like Cynocephali in the name, because they have a dog-headed, maybe it's called the dog-headed baboon, and they're the ones like in Egypt they propose, that people venerated in Egypt. My point is that if you had giant lemurs that had that canine style profile, and they existed up to 350 BC, yes, those ones were in Madagascar. My point is, you have people doing traveling. And if they existed until 350 BC, you got people visiting Madagascar. Back you were telling me nobody stopped over at Madagascar? Give me a break. People are going all across the big oceans. It's a short trip to Madagascar. Of course, some people went to Madagascar. You go to Madagascar and you see this giant lemur thing walking around like this tall. You know what I mean? I could accept people mistaking that for a type of humanoid because it looks like a human. It's the size of a human. It's not primarily bipedal, but they could probably walk around on two legs long enough, but they would look human enough in their skull and area. They would look like dog-headed people. Now, if one of them was brought over on a boat, or a few of them on a boat, and maybe other species did live in nearby lands and science just hasn't found out yet, that would give it a, I think, ancient giant lemurs like that, like Archaeandrus, are a contender for dog-headed people. Now, I think one of the races of dog-headed people were said to be able to talk, but I think the vast majority could not talk. They just barked, yelped, squealed, and this and that there, shrieked, right? Made animal noises, right? No matter how sophisticated they were. 'Cause, I mean, dogs and other animals are intelligent like a child, a human child, but they don't have fingers, right? So if you had the form where you had fingers and you could manipulate things, yeah, it would be like a little civilization of humanoids that had the intelligence of maybe a 3, 4, 5 year old child, right? So they're not going to be super sophisticated, right? They might have made some form of efforts of, like simple educations, and maybe they've made some forms of languages, but they're going to have the intelligence hypothetically of a child, maybe a little bit smarter, but you get my point. They're probably going to be primitive or primal, right? To put it a different way. So, and to back that up, all accounts of werewolves and this and that there. Now, put it this way: vampires. This illustrates it very quickly. Vampires are intelligent. In most cultures, vampires are portrayed as cunning, crafty, and all that there, intelligent and sly. Werewolves, you don't get that. Werewolves don't blend in with people in society. They don't put on suits and clothes and walk around. You know what I mean? They don't look at clocks, or they use staircases and all this. Werewolves are like from the forest. They're like they got a humanoid type body, but they got the mind of a wolf. They don't sit down at coffee and try to make speech with somebody. You know what I mean? Werewolves are typically more primal. So in most cultures around the world, like ferocious and voracious, they only appear at certain times. You know what I mean? And that's probably what, if they were real and they came out at certain times, maybe they're nocturnal. Um, Ancient peoples might think, oh, it's a product of sorcery because we don't normally see them in the daytime. Then at nighttime, maybe on full moons, because they can see better, they see these werewolf type people walking around and think, oh my gosh, you know what I mean? It's sorcery going on, when that's just a more reasonable explanation for it. Maybe there was only a couple hundred of them left on the planet at that point. Maybe each continent only had a couple families left with a few dozen members at the time of, say, a couple 100,000 years ago. Maybe they were dying off. But my point is that's what I think Cynocephali were. I don't think that they're actually half dog and half person, or half wolf and half person. I think there's a more reasonable explanation for it. And ancient people knew about hypertrichosis. So where people get like uber hair growth and they're all covered in hair. There's people going back hundreds of years or more who had hypertrichosis. Those ancient peoples weren't that daft. Like they knew about hypertrichosis. So, and a lot of peoples are very hairy anyways, right around the world. So hypertrichosis didn't fool people. When there was werewolf fear and phenomena up in Europe and everything in the Middle Ages, people with hypertrichosis, there were famous people with hypertrichosis. And it's not like, oh, everybody thought they were werewolves because they had this hair condition, right? Um, Being a werewolf denotes this snout, right? And the only extinct creature that was of human size, of humanoid shape, that could come across to an explorer as a human would be Archaeandrus, for example, or something similar to it. So that's my little proposal for that one. And Meganthropus. Meganthropus would be even more human, would be bipedal, walking around, and would have that same ape-like type head. So I think both are contenders, and I think one just shows a more lemur ape background as a contender, and the other is a more human type background, Meganthropus. So that's my point. We have these two hemispheres where there's probably a lot of other ancient species, extinct species that we don't know about yet in terms of science. We haven't had the fossil remains turn up yet, gotten our hands on them, such as Meganthropus remains are very scant. But the more that we get and the more that we learn, I think, maybe in a few decades of further exploration, they're going to have more findings. I mean, if they never found Meganthropus remains, I wouldn't even have this to talk about. And Archaeandrus remains, I wouldn't even have that to talk about here. There wouldn't be anything else, Homo erectus and all the other archaic humans were very small. Meganthropus is the exception. It's potentially very large, right? His teeth are twice the size. I mean, science's explanation right now is, they may have been around 7 feet, maybe not 9 feet, but just stockier. But the reality is, they could have very well been 9 feet, and that's why their teeth are twice the size. They just have to find more of the skeleton. But in so many cultures around the world, we have these talks of these wild type people. So I just wanted to give one example here. In France, there is one called a Tartaro or Tartalo. And it's from the region of Basque in France, Basque, in southwestern France and northwestern Spain. And it's described basically like a giant ogre type person, but usually with one eye, like a cyclops. So it fits the same trend that we see from all these global accounts of races of cyclops being around that size with one eye. Um, if I'm not mistaken, if we go back over to this source here, is this the one that lives in a cave? Yeah. So the Tartalo in Basque mythology, one-eyed giant, right? Alarabi is another name for the creature, and so is Anxo or Ancho. So let's see, what can I read here? I don't want to read quote it like and have a copyright issue. So uh, yeah, so they're usually cave dwelling. So this fits the same thing like Romans and Greeks and other culture said around the world, like giants and ogres and cyclops, they preferred caves. Like even trolls, like all these forms of wild, ancient, archaic, sometimes monstrous or giant humanoids, they love to live in caves. Now, if you think about it, see, my theory here is that a lot of these ancient mythical humanoids were real, and most of them had more reasonable explanations, like I've already offered, Meganthropus and Archaeoindrus for the dog-headed people, right? Um, and Meganthropus could also explain Bigfoot, right? If Meganthropus was real, if we saw Meganthropus today, it would look like a Bigfoot. I mean, it would legitimately be what we call a Bigfoot. Nobody has like a photo of Bigfoot head to toe, face on. Nobody knows conclusively what its face like. Nobody has documented with photo or video what a Bigfoot face looks like. Trust me, I've seen all the millions of videos and photos out of anything that could be considered credible. There's no way to tell. So we don't know how ape-like, animal-like, or human-like it looks like. We don't know for sure. And it's possible that it does have like a projecting face, like a snout, which some might say looks dog-like, right? And it could be like Meganthropus. Or Meganthropus, once we get a complete skeleton and skull, may not look as much dog-like, baboon-like, or canine-like, or like giant lemurish-like. It might just look like a very powerful ape-like projecting jaw, right? So that's what I mean. But these things are real, and Gigantopithecus was real, even though it wasn't primarily bipedal. That was 10 to 12 feet tall, straight up giant beast. Like when that thing stood up, if you saw a Gigantopithecus standing up, it would look like a giant person. And you could mistake it for a giant, 12 foot tall. But the second it drops back down to its normal position on four legs, then you'd be like, oh, it just looks like some weird giant monkey person thing, right? But if you saw it standing up, right? So, anyways, the Tartar is interesting because it's a species of cyclops, right? And one of the legends of the Tartaro is very similar to the Greek legend of Prometheus. Now, science, of course, likes to say, oh, they're similar because they all came from a mother ancient belief and it just got passed down throughout Europe, throughout the different ancient European tribes. Maybe, right? What pride do you have in adopting other people's beliefs and carrying it on, even though you've never seen something similar? There's no pride in that. You have pride in what your people have historically always believed. Okay, so if it was a mother belief, maybe, but you would also want to create your own national beliefs. If you emigrated to a new land, you're not going to just sit there and talk about all your old land and not have any legends about your new land. You're going to make up stuff about your new land. So the point is that in all the different lands around the world, people talked about these different creatures and beings. So, anyways, the other one is the wild men or the woodwose. So, throughout Europe, especially in later times, more towards recent, like between the first century, from the time of Catholicism onwards, there were wild men. So, throughout Europe, in most places, just like the Tartar and all of that, there, except they weren't cyclopean, there were wild men who are similar in size to the Cyclops, who were just bigger than people, right? Who knows how big for sure, but in all the depictions, they're typically sized between 7 feet, maybe up towards like 15 feet or something. Maybe it's 12. I haven't taken out a tape measure, but maybe twice the size of a person. That's like the biggest one that I've ever seen. But in the vast majority, they're just bigger than people, right? So depending on your local perspective, if these creatures and beings are real, then you would have different names for them, right? So all of our English terms like ogre, giant, this and that, we have to understand that English is a hybridized language that actually came from all these different European ones. A lot of the words are, you get into this whole fancy science about the English language. But at the end of the day, these are all just buzz names. Like they called them trolls or Jotnar over in Scandinavia, Norse lands, and all of that there. And Jotnar troll, as we call it, what are Jotnar? They're just giants. Some of them could look beautiful. Some of them can look hideous. Some of them had tails, but not all of them. And again, tails is what? But an ape-like remnant, genetic remnant. So it's not something impossible. And trolls and Jotnar, the older that they got, the more hideous ones, their noses will get bigger and the ears will get bigger. We know this from genetics now that, well, I mean, you could probably observe it as an ancient person with elderly people. But now that people live longer nowadays, we can more readily know with our sciences that the older you get, the bigger your nose and your ears grow. But if these beings could live 200 years, even just a little bit longer than us, then maybe their noses get really big and their ears get really big for that reason. Maybe that other race that I mentioned earlier that had very big ears, maybe they just have big ears and big noses or whatever because, and you had like the Tengu from China or Japan, the species that had a very big nose. Um, could have existed, right? Maybe they lived to 200, and after 100 years old, their nose is just very big. So if we were to see them, they'd be like, we would be like, what in the world is that? Um, so with the wild men, they're said to exist, generally speaking, bigger than people, maybe 7 to 10 feet tall. Let's just say they generally use trees as clubs. So they break down a small tree, rip it up from the roots. They could, they would use trees for fighting. They'd rip up a tree and fight people with it because they were very, very strong. They were covered with hair, but they were like humans. They weren't ape-like or animal-like. They were in their kind of like look and behavior a bit, but they weren't like animals. They were humans. So that's the difference with the wild men, with the woodwos, which is around Europe and more prominent in the last 2,000 years. They are described as being more human. And because I think when you look at it, they're smaller and more human like, just more wild like, these could actually just be our, human brethren who, just from their genetics and how they passed on their genes from Neanderthal and Homo erectus, Cro-Magnon, and everything else, and whatever else existed we don't know about, their genetic lot was to just be very hairy everywhere. And maybe because they lived out in the forest and, they didn't, that's what they did. They're probably muscular, very fit. They probably had to hunt animals, so they're probably good at running and all of that. And, because they're so hairy, they don't really wear clothing. So they come across as like archaic. Well, we would call them archaic humans now, but people back then, it's like, oh, wild men. You know what I mean? Oh, look, they're the giants. They're the ogres. Some might call them trolls because, I mean, they look like people, but they're big and they're covered in hair. You know what I mean? And some of them may have had vestigial tails as well. So, depending on your country, you'd have different names for them, different cultural perspectives. But these are the beings that everybody said once existed, right? So, if I go look up wild men, I have a really good book here. TVW. There's a link over to a Scottish Wildman story. So here we go. So I'll just read a short little excerpt from this really quick. Wild men or wild men of the woods. These legends were from the 13th to the 16th centuries in Europe, especially in England, also known as woodwoes, woodhouse, woozer, and oozer in Old English. Gigantic, hairy, wielded a club, clad in humanoid type skins. Skin clad humanoid, sometimes with green hair. This is interesting because over in China they had talks of Onis, which were ogres. Now, again, these ogres would have green or red skin. Now, it could be because they sit in the forest and algae grows on them or in their hair. And red skinned, well, there are red skinned people on this earth now. So, with, towards the reddish hue, those are perfectly reasonably possible to have existed, right? They didn't have to look like cartoon depictions of green skin and red skin for them to be realistic. Um, I mean, there's people today in society of all racial backgrounds who have, not to be negative, just, be proud of what you are, right? But I'm saying who have an ogre type build. Now, ogre type builds are kind of cool because ogres aren't necessarily that much taller than people, but their build, their muscle, their bone is like twice. They're like Hercules, you know what I mean? So it's kind of cool in a way. And there are people out there who have ogre like builds. And I don't mean that to be negative. That's what I mean. Like, they have massive jaws, you know what I mean? In every race and culture, massive necks, massive shoulders, massive chests. They're super strong, super burly. They probably typically weigh 300 pounds. They're not necessarily over beasts. They're just huge. And they're very strong naturally, right? They could just be genetic remnants from what others called ogres back in the day, right? Like I said earlier, these wild men from Europe are probably just straight up Homo sapiens who just had the genetics to be very, very hairy. And because they had been society rejects for so long, they never got to advance. So they just were happy living the way that they did out in the wild, and they were demonized for it, right? Probably hunted and ridiculed and all that out of existence. Um, So where is it? So in Scotland we have the Gruagach, if I said that correctly. So let's go read that. Uh, it's Gruagach. So the Gruagach from Scotland, okay, also known as the Grogach or the Grogan. So they're hairy beings with long golden hair. They're also talked about in Northern Ireland. They have large heads. They're known as hairy ogres, and they're said to fit the description of woodwows or wildmen. Um, Says that they can be both malicious and benevolent to homes or farms near where it abides, and mischievous. And that's a characteristic that we see not only with the giants. With giants, you call it barbaric instead of mischievous, but the giants, the goblins, the elves, all this. I'm starting to think that all these different mythical creatures were beings. They were probably real, and they probably were just now extinct remnant branches of humanity that have they died out so long ago that they faded into myth and legend, right? Um, like if we were to see Neanderthals today, they would look vastly different from normal people. Like they have those prominent primitive brows, and some people in the world today, I won't say who, because people feel discriminated against, but some people today have very strong Denisovian DNA and Neanderthal DNA, and they have very prominent brows. Like, and I'm not talking about like the average person. I mean, like most people haven't heard of these tribes and peoples, but they really, really do. But like I always said, be proud of who you are, right? So if you have an archaic look, be proud that you're the oldest ancestor. You know what I mean? There you go. 100% to be proud of that. You know, there's a good reason to be proud of whatever you look like, right? No matter what your background is. I'm not here to discriminate against people. But Neanderthals look very different. Homo erectus, like I said, they probably look like ape people. But all of these, like they commingled and existed at some point. So if you go back hundreds of thousands of years, there probably weren't written traditions that we know of, because they probably may have written, but they got destroyed. Maybe they weren't not written on stone and granite or on metal plates. They're primarily oral traditions, and maybe they wrote on wood. You know what I mean, like using charcoal, and it just didn't survive the stand of time. But from what we know, there's just oral records, right? For hundreds of thousands of years. And I think written records may have only started like 10,000 years ago or something. I don't think there was much, or say tens of thousands of years ago. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, there were probably oral traditions in their own limited intellectual ability, or like some of the branches of archaic humans, right, is very possible, like IQ of 30 or 40 or maybe even less. It's possible, right? I'm pretty sure Coco the gorilla had an IQ of like 80 when she, I think it was a girl or whatever, when Coco was tested, he tested like 80, but he had a lot of training, right? I think a chimp IQ is probably like, I'm not sure, 40 or less, or 20, something like that. So if you're talking about real archaic humans, I don't know, because I'm not a doctor or scientist, but really low IQ is a possibility. Others may have been quite smart. Maybe some are even smarter than us. Who knows, right? It's possible. Neanderthals had a bigger brain, and maybe if you had enough, Aristotles amongst the Neanderthals, maybe they had some who were really smart. Maybe they had a few family bloodlines who were very smart. Their brains worked better, and they developed, caveman science of the time. It's possible. Um, but what I'm getting to is the reality is everybody was mingling together back then. I mean, all those ancient archaic human types, and we would have looked drastically different to one another. And that combined with the other, Meganthropus, Gigantopithecus, Archaeoindris, and others that we don't know about, and giants and ogres, because I'm saying they existed, that became the legends from all around the world. So, no, I don't believe there are people who are half wolf, half person. I just believe that there's some form of dog-headed looking ape that just happens to be really big and bipedal and human-like. That's my point. The races of Cyclops, well, they just obviously had a genetic mutation where they all come out with cyclopia, whatever you call it. Um, Cyclopia happens today. It happens in like 1 in 10,000 births or something like that. It's actually, I think it's worse than that. The numbers, I think it's quite prevalent. It's kind of shocking, but it still happens today. But they don't usually get to grow up. They're not really viable, unfortunately. But we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years ago, or tens of thousands of years ago, or thousands of years ago. Cyclops are said to have been real, and it's not impossible that there was a lineage back then that could somehow survive and live with their cyclopia condition, or whatever form of cyclopia that they had. It's not impossible, right? And even if there is only a couple hundred or a couple thousand, altogether in a few different lands, over time, some of them may have spread out, migrated, gone rogue, and then it spread out to other. And there you have an account of how, well, it doesn't explain how you get across the oceans, but, that's why everybody in ancient times is talking about these things. So, but anyways, the yeah. So that's all I need to read from this book. This book is excellent. Well, actually, no. If I get a copyright thing or ads in my video because I showed that, I'm gonna be pretty irritated. I'd have to remake the video. Um, so the Tartalo, the Tartara, I've already spoken about. The Bassawan, or Bassajuan, is from Basque mythology as well. And they're huge, hairy hominids dwelling in the forests. They build megalithic structures. They're good with animals. They have livestock and all of that. And they know a bit about agriculture and metallurgy. So this is similar to like the Cyclops and other ancient giants, not all giants, but the Cyclops are a race of ancient giants who Romans and Greeks said were good at metallurgy. And they crafted weapons for the Greek gods. So very interesting. Dwarves and everything from mythology were good at metallurgy. Elves and goblins and those types who could have just been, they were just humanoids and still very human looking, just different sizes. Actually, most elves or fairies, depending on your translation, were about human size. And they looked human. So the only difference is they had magic or magical implements, which could have just been technology for all we know, not necessarily castles and dragons magic. And goblins and all of that could have just been hobbit type sized people. Leprechauns could have just been like Flora's hobbit type sized people. Dwarves, we know dwarves are real. People still have dwarfism, so ancient talk of dwarves is entirely 100% possible. Dwarves were another ancient race said to be, that Europe said were good with metallurgy and finding metals and gemstones and things like that. They're very connected with the earth, even gnomes to that extent too, and other earthly elemental um, type beings and creatures. So everybody was talking about these things, right? But Bassawan, um, said to inhabit the forests of Gorbea and Arati. I checked out Gorbea; it looks like a giant mountain, 4,800 feet above sea level. Very snowy-looking mountain. It says that Bassawan had a long mane that ran down their back, that reached down to their feet. So it's very interesting. It says that they had such like a prominence about them, like their presence and their strength, that they're regarded as being like a colossal force that you wouldn't want to run into. And I think there are some accounts of them being friendly to livestock and friendly to farmers who are friendly to livestock. So you could have get some of them who are, positively inclined beings. These are the more human-like ones, remember, and they might have been nice to people who are nice to them. But I'm sure in other communities they looked at these archaic people in the forest and thought, oh, they're monsters, and tried to exterminate them or called them werewolves or different devils and things like that. There, even in Islam, the talk of jinns, everybody talks about jinns as spirits. If you read about jinns are talked about as being hairy and a little bit bigger than us. Okay, there are different jinns, don't get me wrong, but it's a generic term, just like how troll or yatnar is a generic term. Oh, it's confusing, but there isn't really a word for giant up in those Norse type regions. beliefs, it's more. I was shocked to learn it's more. Jotnar is just a Jotnar. Like we call them trolls now, but that's not really like what they are or what they're called. So like Jotnar is just a Jotnar. They can be human sized. They can be really huge. Right? They can be all different sizes. So it just basically denotes a different like lineage or species or whatever you would call a category of human. Um, that obviously ranged in height, and some of them had tails, and some of them were hairy, some of them were monstrously ugly looking, some of them were beautiful. And the beautiful side probably came from their archaic ancestors breeding with people. So, I mean, even in the tales of Bigfoot, like in North America, you have so many tribes, dozens and dozens of tribes, probably hundreds. But I read through dozens of tribes, like 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen tribes' beliefs on giants, cannibals, ogres, Bigfoot, and all those types. And the connections are astonishing. There's so many different mentions of them everywhere you look, from top, bottom, left, and right throughout North America, even in Central America and down into South America. It's a little bit less in South America, but they're still there. But all throughout North America, they all talk about them. And each tribe of these Bigfoot or whatever you call them is different. Some of them are more primal and animal like, and they're just savage. Other ones are more intelligent and friendly, but that's kind of rare. So the Bigfoot, if you saw a Bigfoot up in ancient Europe, they would just call it a wild man. So, but how human are Bigfoot? You know what I mean? Are Bigfoot more like Meganthropus, more ape-like? Are they more human-like the European wild man? Now, I've put out a theory before. In ancient Norse tradition, they said that I think it was Odin or Thor struck this giant bell with his hammer, and the sound of it was so, you know, terrible to all the trolls that they got up and fled the land, right? Maybe it was a real story. Maybe they just particularly hate that sound, or that note frequency just hurts them like torture, and they can't take it. Maybe it was some giant bell, and maybe Thor is a pretty big guy, and when he rang it, it just, and I'm pretty sure it was after a battle anyways, and they knew it wasn't just a normal day in the park for them, and they hate that noise, and they're like, oh, if we don't get out of here now, he's just gonna sit here and ring that bell every day. They actually put church bells in churches to chase trolls away. That's actually the origin of church bells in churches, believe it or not. That's why they ring the bells first, is to clear out any trolls and stuff, because they don't like that sound. Very interesting. I learned that as well. Every church that has church bells, that's why they actually originally had church bells. Um, So it traces back to that tradition that, Odin or Thor, whichever one it was, drove them out of the land. Now, where did they go? Well, I read those ancient stories, and it says that they actually the trolls got into a boat. I don't know if they had their own boat, or if they, jumped in people's boats as stowaways, or what they did, or just stole a human boat. But it says they got in boats and went across, I'm pretty sure, towards the west, which would be towards North America, and we're not seen again up in Europe. That was the Jotnar, the trolls, right? Because they were mischievous and this and that there, and barbaric to each their own. Some of them were civilized and beautiful, some of them were mischievous and barbaric, right? To each their own, but they all fled the land. Now, the civilized and beautiful ones usually bred with people and were more pleasant to interact with and all of that, such as in Greece and Rome, in Greek and Roman mythology or beliefs. Um, their gods were the Jotnar. It's just a different name, just a cultural name, right? The Jotnar were just the giants. Some of them were beautiful. Now, the beautiful ones were the Greek and Roman gods. That's the thing. Now, if you read Greek and Roman mythology, they talk about when, they came down, they symbolize it as Uranus, which is the heavens coming down to Gaia, Earth, and they bore children. So the forces of Uranus, of the heavens coming down, were Cronus and whoever else, like the forefathers to the Greek gods, and they were giants. Okay, and when they came down here, um, well, Cronus was the spawn of Uranus, but Uranus symbolizes the heavens coming down. So they arrived. Now they look human, but they're bigger than us, right? Yes, ancient astronaut and all that, yes, but they came down. They looked human. Now they could have been from this earth. I was thinking about this earlier, and I want to mention it because it's pretty cool. We got all our technological advancement in about 50 years, basically. You could sum it up like that, or 100 years if you want to put it like that. But at most, all of our technological and scientific advancement that we have today is just from a few hundred years. You do not have to go back thousands of years for technological scientific advancement. Now, mechanical building technological science in advancement. That goes all the way back to the Pyramid of Egypt, right? The Great Pyramid. Now, the ironic thing, I was thinking about it, is that that's the oldest example of clearly they had a science of building mechanics, right? They didn't have good science elsewhere because they used to put dead mice in your mouth to help toothaches, and they used to put crocodile dung up inside your private parts to help with monthly cycles, um, or as contraceptive, one of the two, right? So they had some pretty screwed up science in other places, but they had good building science, evidently, or somebody did because the pyramids are there, right? And all the other stuff that they built. But ironically, what that shows us is A, we still don't know how they built it all because it's not actually documented in their own texts how it's done, right? Even if they did it, we just don't know how for sure they did do it. Um, Secondly, it is the oldest example, basically, on the earth of such precise mechanical science being implemented. So that's the irony. It is the one of the best examples, but it's also the oldest. So then the question comes in: well, where did that come from, and how long did it take for humans to get to that point? We don't know because it's the oldest example, and there's nothing else really before. Göbekli Tepe, whatever you call it, that's just some rough, crude blocks stacked together. Looks like a child carved them. Big deal, right? We're talking about Egypt. No comparison. I don't care how big and widespread globally Tepe is, right? My point is that you got some serious, definite mechanical science going on with building the Great Pyramids in these giant columns and all that stuff. So they had it, but the point is that my other logical point is that going back thousands of years, one of the first sciences that people pioneered wasn't chemical science, surprisingly. I would have thought that'd be one of the first. Chemical science, chemistry, actually came from alchemy in the medieval ages. So all the people studying alchemy and all that, because I've studied like everything, right? All the religions, alchemy, all the magic orders, all this and that there, right? And alchemy literally became what we now know as chemistry because they were the ones who were actually making scientific discoveries, but they just didn't have the science to it. Of, oh, if I combine this and that, it produces phosphorus and makes a light glow. And to them, it's like magic and spooky sorcery, right? People back then. But they were starting to clue into it because they were essentially becoming like the first scientists, chemistry scientists. So, anyways, we got stuff like that. Now, astronomy and building sciences are much more ancient. So we had Sumerians and Egyptians and all them who had astronomical science, which is fairly accurate, and building mechanics science, which was fairly accurate. Both are kind of impressive because, as smart as I think I am, my IQ is like 140 or 150. The thing is, I'm not smart enough to make. If I was in their shoes, I don't think I could be doing all that stuff. Maybe if that was my life, maybe I would have devoted it to it. But that takes serious brain power to come up with astronomical sciences, looking at the stars and mapping things out and calculating orders and periods, and that's pretty impressive that ancient peoples did that. But this is building sciences, building mechanics sciences, and astronomy sciences. Now, the ancient Romans and a few others got down a bit of plumbing and like hydrodynamics and that type of thing. But was the Romans are pretty sophisticated, but that's much later, right? Um, my point is that the only real sciences, like botanical science, was very crude, even up until about a couple hundred years ago. Very crude in a lot of the world. Yes, China had very highly documented. So did Europe. And a lot of stuff that people still believe in China is wrong. Just because they knew a lot of stuff and had a lot of plants identified and all that. One of the ancient Chinese guys, like scientists of the day, literally went around. It's a pretty cool story. He went around. It's the type of thing I would do, but also at the same time wouldn't do because how dangerous it would be. He literally went around the lands, and all props to this guy. This is like a sacrifice like Jesus made, kind of, because he felt that it was his like divine mission essentially to go around and sample every type of plant that exists, everything in every land that he could travel to. So he went everywhere, like drew it, documented it, ate it to see its effects. That takes courage because he definitely ate some poisonous plants along the way, you know what I mean? But he devoted his life as like a sacrifice essentially and did that. I don't know if he died from it or survived it, but that's kind of cool. I always like that story. That was pretty interesting. That takes a lot of bravery and nerve to do that. I certainly couldn't. I mean, can you imagine eating every type of mushroom that you find to find medicinal ones and not? That's why they have such a good, like fairly accurate herbal science, right? because they have all those thousands of years where they had people like that guy there. I think he was like the chief or pioneer of it all, basically, because he documented so much. But even India had good botanical documentation, but again, not everything was super accurate. Like Ayurvedic stuff, I read all their texts. Like they have some really astounding scientific achievements. Um, in Hinduism, their ancient culture and texts and all that with maths. Um, and with botanical stuff and chemistry. But at the end of the day, everybody had certain major concepts wrong in all the world cultures, right? The world only really started perfecting those other sciences in the last few hundred years. So my point originally was is that just a few hundred years, we went from basically nothing to everything we have today, flying around space and landing craft on different planets, right? In TVs and everything else, right? It's pretty fantastic. Live streams, for heaven's sake. This will be like voodoo magic to ancient people, you know what I mean? But we can do that now. Just a couple hundred years. And really the technological side in just 50, right? Nearing 100 now, probably about 70 years now, right? But that's astounding. Now, at any point in Earth's history, you could have had a break off township or city or civilization of humans that had just kept to themselves or kept their technological advancement secret and just pioneered and whatnot. It only took them a couple hundred years, let's just say. Remember, the Earth back then had been a lot more peaceful. If you lived in a great place that was far away from other people's, no contention nearby, you could flourish. And if you didn't have certain like theological beliefs weighing you down dogmatically and you had scientific liberty, people could excel in a couple hundred years or less, just like we did. And ancient man was working with metals. Now, I couldn't go into a mountain, find copper ore, extract it, and make copper tools, but they did that thousands of years ago. You know what I mean? Nobody here today could go do that stuff. That's like a lost art, but ancient people did that. So ancient peoples thousands of years ago knew where to get all the metals from. You know what I mean? They had some elements of chemistry type knowledge there. They had a foundation to work by. So if you're talking about 1,000, 2,000, heck, even a few thousand years ago, and maybe even more hypothetically, but in the last 2,000 years, it's perfectly possible that a little break off group of people that got advanced, kept it to themselves, and then departed from the earth. Maybe they went to the moon and colonized the moon. Maybe they went to Mars. Maybe they went somewhere else. Maybe they're just flying around in a spaceship that they developed. Is it impossible? No, it's not. We went from not having televisions, okay? We went from not having even a television, okay? No computers, nothing. Like in the 40s, okay? Well, not to fuss. Like in the 40s, in the 1940s, televisions, radio was like spooky science. It was just coming out. In people's homes, they may have had radios, but they didn't have TVs. All that stuff was like voodoo. Okay, people didn't know how it worked. The average person, only scientists who were trying to make it work. Okay, in the military, they had it about 10, 20 years before that. That's not the point. To the public person, from 1940 until 1960 something, in 20 years, they had rebuilt rocket ships and were landing on the moon. So you're talking about going from that primitive, we don't even have TVs. Like, what's a TV? To, oh, we got rocket ships, we're flying 18,000 miles per hour and we're landing on the moon. How the hell did you calculate that? Oh, with our computers. You're what? In 20 years, right? So, and we haven't come that much further since the 60s in terms of space advancement, right? A lot of our greatest achievements are things that were launched in the 60s and 70s off into space, arriving at super distant locations now. My point is that a lot can be achieved in a short period of time, especially if it's unhindered. Okay? And at any point in the last 2,000 years, any group of people could have been unhindered and advanced. And all ancient people a few thousand years ago had knowledge of metallurgy. They had that basic foundation. Ancient man knew metallurgy. They figured it out thousands of years ago, right? And good for them. So they were able to build stuff and tinker with things. And it probably wouldn't take that long for them to figure out certain things. Okay. And, throughout the 1800s and times in 1700s, there were mysterious flying ships seen around in Europe. Okay. And in the Hindu texts and the Hindu tradition, it talks about Vimanas. Certain groups of people or other humanoids like the Rakshasas and such, they had flying craft. They had craft on the ground that drove around on wheels, and they had flying craft that didn't use wheels. Okay? And their flying craft, one of the secret engines that's described, uses, I think it's a pool of mercury. When you go in the engine room, it's like a giant pool of mercury, liquid mercury, and there's like a sphere at the middle, and somehow it's electrified, or the sphere starts spinning and becomes electrified, and then it flies around like that. Because it gives like the recipe on how to make it, right? So, anyways, and that actually has connections to known verified science now, right? You know what I mean? So that's kind of astounding. So it's possible that these ancient peoples, maybe indirectly, because they're being like alchemists or messing with mercury and stuff, maybe they noticed these principles one day, and it wouldn't take 2,000 years of European scientific development to come to this point. They were just being their alchemists, messing with mercury and doing what else, and you know what I mean? Or maybe somebody found uranium type ore and it had these effects. I think it glows in the dark, does it, or something? Or, all these different things. It depends where you live. People have different access to different minerals. Maybe there's a very wealthy place and they're like, hey, go off to all the distant lands and buy all the super special, cool looking stuff. So they go around, come back, and they got every single blinking type of thing you can think of. And then their scientific people start tinkering with all the different elements. They'll get a super increased scientific knowledge base built up way faster when everybody else around them is like, duh, you know what I mean, selling off all the ores and minerals that they could learn scientifically from. They're just selling it off for money. Things like this are possible. So my point is that, long-winded but interesting to imagine and picture, very well there could have been a break-off civilization that gained space technology and left, maybe just went to the moon or Mars, but not impossible. A couple more decades, they could go interstellar, right? Like us today. They could have gone off into space. Now, this could have happened thousands of years ago, or it could have happened 500 years ago, or maybe hypothetically even 10,000 years ago. Not impossible. You know what I mean? It's not impossible. You could have had a lot of people back then, early Homo sapiens, who are of moderate Homo sapien IQ, and you would have gotten some who are smarter. You know what I mean? And if they got together and utilized their intelligence, they could achieve a lot of amazing things, right? It's possible. But, anyways, it's not impossible. That's my point. But it's more possible that this said thing took place in the last few thousand years. But where it gets cool and interesting is that the Greek gods and everybody, symbolized by Uranus, came down before the flood. They came down a certain period of time before the flood. Now, long story short, in my own research from about 20 years ago, I deduced that it was roughly 1,000 years before the flood for blah, blah, blah reasons. Let's keep it short. Okay, so about 1,000 years before the flood. And it does fit with, I think it was the book of First Enoch, and whatnot, but whatever, who cares? They came down about and one of the king lists, I think Manetho's, there was two or three king lists from ancient times, and one of them lists the kings of Atlantis in order. And it kind of lines up with one of the other king lists, but just it's out of order, right? So they're basing it on some ancient tradition, right? That Atlantis ruled these parts of the known world before, when Atlantis was destroyed. So if Atlantis was destroyed by the great biblical flood of around 2,450 BC or so, they were talking about that the Greek gods and them came down about 3,450 BC. So let's just say 3,500 BC. Now this is still within biblical times. This is during the times of Adam and the early patriarchs of the Bible, right? So it fits in with the biblical perspective, and it fits in with the Greek and Roman, and the timing and all that fits out. Now, if you look around the world, all these other places around the world had the same type of traditions. Now, to check this out, most cultures, most tribal cultures around the world in all continents have legends about sky brothers or beings, gods, who came down. And a lot of the times, not just that, but a lot of the times, they were twins, okay, or brothers that looked alike. Now, you would be shocked to know how much that has passed around the world. In North America, yep. In oceanic countries, they have that. I was shocked because I like reading all the different beliefs around the world. I'm like, how many times are these twin thunder gods going to show up? They're giants, right? And they're tall. So, and it even matches up with the book of Gilgamesh and the book of Giants from the Dead Sea Scrolls, because Hiwa and Hawa, I think, were the names of the two giant sons of Humbaba or Gilgamesh, one of the two, right? It was one of the first two sets of sons. And if you read Greek and Roman mythology, you had, who was the forefather of Atlantis? Was it Poseidon? And he had 10 pairs of twins as children, right? And often with the Greek and Roman gods, we see that when they have children or when they interbreed with humans and bear offspring, they have these mutations. They come out as cyclops or come out as giants or come out in these different forms depending on what was taking place and what was interbred with. So I'm thinking there is a genetic component here that ancient peoples didn't fully understand, right? Um, and they had the ability to regenerate limbs and recover from wounds. To each their own, right? Like I said before, Prometheus was punished by being chained to a rock, and a giant eagle that would come down. They do know that there were giant eagles that were up to 24 feet wingspan. They've proven them now. They did exist and interact and eat ancient people, right? So it's a fact. But a giant eagle will come down every day and rip and tear and eat part of his liver. The liver is an organ that regenerates anyways, kind of like how the lungs do. So that alone is a cool scientific fact. But I guess when you're of the sky brethren, that your genetics are just better and more advanced and you just heal better. So my point is that these sky brethren, the symbolized by Uranus, who came down, the Greek and the Roman gods, and many historians and archaeologists would agree that many in that circle would agree that the European and the Hindu tradition have Indo-European, more ancient, like mother belief system, which has been supported by a lot of archaeology and all of that. Um, I can get with that. I studied Hinduism for 15 years. There are undeniable connections over to Greek and Roman mythology. So it's undeniable, right? Like I even have who is who pinned down. Like there's no denying it's the same thing. So in all these cases and all these traditions from tribal peoples around the world and a lot of religions around the world, sky beings came down, but they looked like us. And some of them, or all of them, were bigger than us, but not necessarily. The counts of size can differ, right? But a lot of them will say that they're bigger, and they'll even draw and depict them in their carvings and artwork as being bigger, but human. Now, the Bible says that these were the sons of God, and it was forbidden for them to interbreed with anything on the earth. That's a logical rule to have as a cosmic law, but they broke it because they thought Earth human women looked really beautiful. And the book Enoch records us as saying that Azazel led 200 of the watchers. Excuse me, they are called. There are 600 of them stationed to watch over the earth, to, come down to the earth and mingle with early man and help, teach them whatever. But they ended up teaching them bad arts, forbidden sciences that they shouldn't have been teaching at the time, and like how to make implements of war and how to make poisons and all this, right? So they gave people all this knowledge before the flood, but they also were sleeping with the people. Now, if you're bigger than human and you're from a different part of space, like you may have been ancestrally from this earth, like I was saying, maybe your ancestors were from the earth 10,000 years ago, they got advanced, flew off into space, right? Well, things can be very different off in space for 10,000 years. You might come back looking maybe even a little bit different, right? Your lifespan might be different after being on a planet with a different day cycle and all of that. You don't know what type of changes happen from a different cosmic setting, right? Or even just floating through space on a giant interstellar mothership that they just decided to live on. Maybe they made like an indestructible mothership. It's kind of a cool idea. And they just lived on that, floating through space for 10,000 years. And but at some point, 3,500 BC, they came back down to the Earth. That's to all the ancient peoples on the planet, where they talked about the sky brothers, the sky beings, the gods coming down, or the heavens coming down to the earth, or the sky falling. That's what was taking place. So it's just more realistic to think that they came from our earth originally than to think that aliens elsewhere look just like us. Or maybe we look just like aliens elsewhere because we came from one cosmic ancestor. Maybe it's all because God makes us all look the same. Whatever. I'm just saying, right? Wherever they came from doesn't matter. It's just fun to think about these things. But these big humans came down 3,500 BC, about 1,000 years roughly before the flood. Now they are meant to govern over the earth, like the Bible says. And they did. They were the lords. They were called the Baals. They were worshipped. And they governed over as rulers, magistrates, lords, and all of that. Good for them. That's what they're supposed to do. But the thing is, the people were ignorant. The people started worshiping them because they're so amazed by their size, their strength, their power, I guess their technology that they had and all of that. Like Zeus didn't shoot lightning bolts out of his hand. Zeus asked the Cyclops, who were metallurgists, to create a metal rod, and the metal rod would actually shoot out lightning, plasma. So discharge electrical plasma or electrical charge. That's what Zeus's staff rod was. Is a technological implement. A lot of elves and this and that from European legends, they didn't necessarily all have magic powers. Sometimes they had magic wands. It's always like some type of implement, or they had a magic gateway that they would go through. Usually, I find there's technological aspects to it as well. And I think elves could have just been a branch of humans that were just, or maybe extraterrestrial humans, whatever, right? But very human looking, usually more beautiful or beautiful looking, and less grotesque looking, but around human size, but slender, very, you know, fairly built and everything, very finely built. And they just were more advanced. And if they walked around, they would look different and seem elf like. You know what I mean? So it's not impossible. You could get ones that, God bless them, were a little bit more ugly looking, and they would be goblins or the, all those types, right? Dark elves. Um, but again, a lot of these elven types and goblin types, they all had mischievous natures, and they were good at building trinkety things and having good chemistry knowledge, and probably a good mineral and gemstone knowledge and all that to grind certain minerals down. Like every gemstone is made out of a different element, right? So if you find these different gems, and each element produces a different color, so it's not just about collecting sparkly, colorful gems. If you grind them down in this and that, they have like pure elements in there, and they're used for like concoctions and potions and chemical reactions, right? And like you can get what is it, mercury from cinnabar. Cinnabar is a crystal that grows, right? And if you melt it down or something, I think you get mercury. Oh no, that's asbestos. I don't know what either. Asbestos, the same thing, right? Cinnabar, I think you get mercury from cinnabar, red cinnabar. You melt it down and like mercury comes out. That's how ancient peoples could get it. And fiber, asbestos, not fiberglass, asbestos is a natural thing, right? It occurs as well. See, and a lot of people theorize that asbestos was linked to salamanders in elemental mythology, but I think that's ridiculous. I think people just knew of a type of reptile that could live in heat or fire, like around volcanoes, and it was just known as the salamander. To say that the salamander was not real and just a metaphor, I don't. It's just a little bit ridiculous. They say that the salamander was actually asbestos, right? Maybe it was just a metaphor. That's what the ancient alchemists meant, but I wouldn't put it past there being some reptile that lived near volcanoes or in fire somewhere or something like that. There, we have crabs under the ocean around 500-degree thermal vents and boiling away, and they're just sitting there living their daily lives. Why not some lizard somewhere that can withstand high heat or like sulfuric flames or fumes? So, anyways, right? But where was I going with this again? The ancient, the sciences. So the sky beings, the large people from space came down about 1,000 years before the flood as governors for the earth. This is where all the religions connect over back with the Bible. And then the people started worshiping them. Now, the problem is, depending on your religious perspective, that's against God of the Bible. God of the Bible got upset at this, and he punished. In First Enoch, it talks about how the angels are punished for teaching the people forbidden things, and they're going to be punished and imprisoned under the earth and all that. And in other religions, different things are said to each their own. But overall, it's the same thing all around. The sky family comes down. The forefathers come down from the heavens, and they come down to the earth, and then the earth family is created. Some stories say the earth family comes straight from then. Sumerians said that the sky family came down and hybridized people with what could only be like apes or Homo erectus or something on the earth, which is very interesting. They said they climbed trees, they were hairy, and this and that. I'm pretty sure that's in the Sumerian, and it wasn't something made up by Zechariah Sitchin. No, I'm pretty sure in the actual Sumerian it does say that. Yeah, even if he elaborated stuff in his text, I do remember. I'm pretty certain that I've read, because I went to fact check it one day. In the Sumerian, it does talk about that. But in either case, right? Doesn't really matter. I'm just sidetracking. Um, but they created the human family here, whether through hybridization or what, right? I personally don't believe we evolved from monkeys. I just don't. Okay, Science would say, but we have all these skeletons. I would say, but yeah, those skeletons very well could have existed because some beings did evolve from apes and monkeys. The more ape monkey looking ones did. Got no problem saying that. Australopithecus, Lucy, the little monkey looking person, whatever they look like, yeah, they evolved from apes. Apes evolved into that. We have chimps and gorillas and orangutans today. They're just not bipedal. If you want to imagine that there were bipedal ones and they all died out, unsuccessful for whatever reason, or they became us, that's fine, but they're more on the ape side of things. So they weren't really people, okay? Really. Because, if we had a 6 foot tall gorilla today that could talk, we still wouldn't consider it a person, okay? Um, what was it? But we have ones that are more ape animal like, then we have ones that are more human like. Okay, so um, man, I forgot where I was going with this. I'm scared how long I've been talking. An hour and 20 minutes. That's way too long. I do have to kind of get going. Um, Let me just make sure I'm not going to skip some important point that I wanted to make. But anyways, I think I've covered all the main things. Like I talked about Meganthropus, the wild men, the woodwas, what I think they could have been from different branches of archaic. Oh, now I think I remember what it was. Yeah. So I was saying that some of the ancient species that existed, in my hypothetical response to what science would say, oh, but we have remains of these early humans, and so we know they were real. Yeah, you have those remains, but you don't know that we came from them. Okay, some of them might be related to us because of some interbreeding that occurred back then. Okay, but I believe the religious perspective, and like all these other world religions, they agree with the Bible in the sense that this heaven to earth family creation thing took place and ulterior interbreeding took place, like the Bible and other religions say. Even in Greek and Roman says the same thing. So this interbreeding did take place. For example, in Sumerian, when the gods had these children, they had Enkidu, who was a wild man type brother of Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh wasn't like a wild man, but Enkidu was. Now, Enkidu had like horns and he was covered in hair, and I think he might even had a tail. He was very burly and primal, very strong, but he was good with the animals. So, even if this is a true or not a true story, it still shows a precedent that it shows the backbone for what is genetics, right? And how genetics end up working with, parents and offspring and hybridization and all this. And we do, as humans, have these ancient genes in us. If we go back thousands of years, it's perfectly possible that somebody may have had two children. One of them was very hairy. And, I know horns is a little bit extreme, but some people do get bumps or projections. It's still, humans can grow horns. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it could have just been that they had a skull. I'm not saying I have to believe that the guy had horns. I'm just offering a reasonable explanation. Some people do grow horns, right? They could have been a line of genetics that was very prone to growing keratin horns. There you go. Answer. Problem solved. They're not part animal. They're not part uh, ox. You know what I mean? They're not a minotaur. They're just of a species of a lineage of humans, unfortunately, that was very prone to keratinization in the grew horns on their head. And maybe to look cool, instead of having lots of horns, they would try to get the two horns on the side, right? That might look kind of cool, like how Vikings had on their helmets. Maybe that's what the people would do. See, a more reasonable explanation for something instead of a more fantastic explanation. And these people may have been more hairy. And I think if you had a hairy, wild type person, big and strong, big and burly, right, and they have keratinized type horns growing on their head, you might think that they're a bull person or a minotaur or an Enkidu, right? They may have had those primitive, way more primitive, archaic human type teeth, like Meganthropus had these big giant incisors up in the front. A lot of cultures around the world describe the giants, ogres, and this and that as having like big teeth that stick out at the bottom or at the top, right? So there you go. It's just if a baboon or certain gorillas and apes smile, or you pull their gum down, you see their teeth are huge up in the front, the big biting ones. They're like that, the big incisors. So if you got that and they're growing out bigger, and maybe you're a different species and they're just a little bit longer, that's what ogres would be. Big, hairy, maybe a different racial looking background, even maybe it's a lost tribe of people and we don't have people that look like that distinctly anymore, and that would make them look different and perhaps frightening to ancient peoples who weren't familiar with them. Like how I said earlier, only a greenish tint skin or reddish tint skin. A lot of people is a reddish skin, but people don't really have greenish skin. There was an account of when some green skinned children showed up in Europe once, which a lot of people believe was a real story. So, there could actually been people who were green of skin, and it could have been green because of diet or something they always put on their skin to make it green. My point is that you had all these different types of looking people, and they didn't all come from apes. Like, I don't believe we evolved from apes. My belief here doesn't have to ruin the video, though, right? My belief is separate from all this, but I'm just stating my belief. I don't believe we evolved from apes. I believe that we came from the more heavenly source. Okay, because I believe that God created us. I believe that He created the original form of each creature, and He allowed for evolution in between forms and this and that there and that, and even allowed for hybridization where it is genetically possible. Because God, obviously, that's what life shows. So I think that we're from that heavenly origin, not from the earthly origin. I think the earthly origin are the ones that died out, that don't exist anymore. They really were just archaic ape-type humanoids. That's my overall theory. Okay, I think we are from a heavenly source. Okay, that would explain why there isn't a real good blend from archaic ape-like person to human. It's kind of just like ape, 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 ape. Oh, human, right? There's no like nice, convenient blend in between. They're finding lots of skeletons of ape-like people, but like I said, they're just advanced humanoid-looking apes. Their evolution advanced where they were bipedal. They might have still been as dumb as a chimpanzee, though. And who's to say they evolved into us? Just because they're similar, that doesn't mean anything. You know what I mean? Lemurs and gorillas and chimpanzees look very similar to us. We're quite different. A lot of creatures that once walked the earth were bipedal. A lot of dinosaurs were bipedal, spent all their time walking around on two legs, had two arms, even had fingers that they could manipulate to do things. Oviraptors did. So a lot of creatures for millions of years had bipedalism with manipulatable arms and digits, right? So um, just because you found some ape-looking humanoids doesn't mean that we evolved from them. That's just my point. But science just refuses to believe that we came from elsewhere. That's fine. I understand. That's perfectly fine. Um, but at the end of the day, the reason my answer for why we find these different types is, well, some of those who evolved on this earth may have been able to interbreed with some of us. It could have been because, like I said, those who came down from space may have actually originally been archaically from early Earth, tens or hundreds of thousands of years earlier, maybe even millions for all we know, um, like that Solarian hypothesis type thing, or it's some ancient time period. That's possible, or there's just humans throughout the cosmos in different places, or maybe just in this galaxy. You know what I mean? In a few planets, there are humans, and maybe we got dropped off here ages ago. I don't know. Or what I believe, because I just think it makes most sense, is God is real. He created things. He put human-like life on many planets. They might be different in certain ways, but whatever. They look like us. Some of them came down here. They weren't supposed to interbreed with us, but they did, and they created giants. God had created us as Earth humans and put us here as that. The ones from space came down and interfered with all of that. But the ones who came down from space were worshipped as gods by all the other tribes of peoples on the planet. And the tribes of peoples believed that they were the sky creators who came down and created life on the planet. Okay, when in reality, they came down, did forbidden interbreeding, and begat all the giants and monstrous hybrid things that ran around the world for ancient people to be afflicted by. Another interesting thing is a lot of these hybrid creatures, like griffins, dragons, hydras, and all these other creatures, they were the progeny of these gods or fallen angels, whatever you want to call them, interbreeding with people or animals. So their DNA just enabled, another old theory of mine was that they just had this advanced celestial DNA that could rapidly adapt to anything. That's why they could heal really fast. It was hard to kill them. It seemed like they were immortal. They had really long lifespans, maybe even regrow a limb if possible. All these things are not impossible. It is biologically possible, and that's what they could have had. There'd be another good reason why God would say, don't interbreed with people. People start getting these abilities, and people aren't good enough to have these abilities. And most remember, the angels, when they came down, were good. They didn't come down as bad ones, right? Even Azazel and them, they were sent down here by God. Like they had a good job to do, and I think they probably did do a good job for a while until things went wrong. And they decided to teach some forbidden things and lusted over the people. I think even if I think the lusting over the people and the interbreeding was the big bad thing. I mean, teaching people arts and sciences isn't evil in itself. It's just that humanity wasn't ready for it then. And they may have actually been maliciously teaching them or stupidly or ignorantly teaching them dangerous things. Like, oh, this is how you can make, a dangerous weapon type thing. You know what I mean? Or a poison. And, this is how you can make napalm, right? And maybe they are teaching them stuff like that or forbidden sorcery. I don't know, right? But at the end of the day, that's what I believe. I believe that's where we came from, and I believe that the reason why they could have because the argument would be that how could something from space interbreed with something on Earth? Well, like I said, those possibilities. If what is up in space and that came back to Earth, okay, was actually originally from the Earth, okay. Another thing is that when God created us, put in the religious perspective again, God created apes, God created humans, God created ape-looking humanoids. Where is the mystery? Is there something else that God created that ended up dying out on this planet? Well, the dodo birds did. They don't walk around. Elephant birds did. They don't walk around, but they're 100% real. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean that we evolved from them, right? So just because they found some skeletons of ape humanoids doesn't mean that we evolved from them. Yeah, they look similar to us. Okay, fine. That's the way God made them. You want a more sciencey explanation for it? Okay, well, they're just ape humanoids. We didn't evolve from them. Where did we evolve from? Where I already stated what I believe. That's my overall point in all of this. But anyways, I've waffled on enough. An hour and a half is my cutoff point. So, anyways, take care.